At 6:47 on the morning of September 12, 1943, Sergeant William Billy Kowalski was lying on his back under the right wing of a P-38, lightning at Nadzib airfield in New Guinea, with a flashlight between his teeth and blood dripping from his left index finger. He had exactly 11 minutes before the morning inspector arrived. 11 minutes to finish a modification that violated 7 different military regulations. 11 minutes before they discovered what he'd been doing for 3 weeks. And if they found out, Kowalski wouldn't just face court-martial. He'd face charges of sabotage during wartime, maximum penalty, execution by firing squad. But Kowalski wasn't sabotaging anything. He was saving lives. Or at least that's what he told himself every time his hand trembled while installing that damned piece of wire he'd stolen from an abandoned chicken coop 6 kilometers south of the field. His hands were covered in black grease. The cut on his finger dripped blood onto the hot metal of the boom. The air smelled of engine oil, aviation fuel, and the metallic scent of his own blood. In the distance, he could hear voices. Footsteps approaching. The inspector was coming early. Kowalski had maybe 4 minutes now, not 11. His fingers fumbled with the aileron control cable in the tight darkness of the boom. He found the pulley joint, started to disconnect the locking pin. The pin was stuck, corrosion maybe, or just bad luck. The voices were closer now. Check the entire line. Every aircraft. I want cable tension reports on each one. Shit, it was Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the most meticulous inspector in the 5th Air Force. Kowalski pulled harder on the pin. His hand slipped. The cut opened wider, more blood. The pin came out with a metallic click that seemed to echo like a gunshot. Kowalski froze, waited, listened. The voices kept approaching. They hadn't heard him yet. He had maybe 2 minutes. His hands shook as he pulled the wire tensioner from his pocket. A simple piece of galvanized wire, bent into a Z-shape 15 centimeters, cost $0, if you didn't count the fact that he'd stolen it from abandoned property. This small piece of metal was all that separated his pilots from death. And now, possibly, it was all that separated Kowalski from a firing squad. He began to install the tensioner. The problem with the P-38 Lightning wasn't power. The 2 Allison V1710 engines generated 1,475 horsepower each. It wasn't speed. In a dive, the P-38 could reach 485 miles per hour. It wasn't armament. 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon could destroy any Japanese aircraft in a 3-second burst. The problem was response. The P-38's aileron control cables traveled a complex path. They ran from the control stick in the cockpit, passed through the central fuselage, up through the twin booms, around the tail sections, then back forward through a system of pulleys to finally connect to the control surfaces in the wings. It was a path of nearly 26 feet, and somewhere along that path, the system accumulated slack. Not much, maybe 4 millimeters, 5 at most. But those 4 millimeters created a microscopic delay between the moment a pilot moved the stick and the moment the ailerons actually responded. In straight and level flight, it didn't matter. At high speed, it didn't matter. But in low-speed combat, in tight turns, when a zero was 200 meters off your tail, trying to get perfect deflection, those 4 millimeters of slack translated to approximately a quarter second of lag. And a quarter second, in aerial combat, was the difference between going home or falling in flames over the New Guinea jungle. Kowalski had explained this to Lieutenant Morrison, the squadron engineering officer, 6 weeks ago. Morrison had pulled the Lockheed technical specifications, had checked the numbers, had consulted the manuals. Factory tolerance allows up to 5 millimeters of slack, Morrison said, his voice carrying that confident arrogance of men who'd never seen combat. Your aircraft are within specifications, Sergeant. The problem isn't mechanical, it's tactical. But Kowalski knew Morrison was wrong, because Kowalski had seen the eyes of pilots when they returned from missions, had seen Lieutenant Marcus DeLuca, 22 years old, hands shaking so hard he could barely light a cigarette, had heard DeLuca say, with a broken voice, "I moved the stick, Billy, I moved it, but the aircraft ... delayed. It was just an instant, but it was enough time. Enough time for the zero to get inside his turn. Enough time for 20mm cannons to tear off half his tail. Enough time for DeLuca to almost die. And DeLuca was one of the lucky ones. He'd survived. 9 other pilots hadn't been so fortunate. In July of 1943, the 432nd Fighter Squadron had lost 9 aircraft in combat, 9 P-38s, 9 pilots. The attrition rate was unsustainable. If it continued, the entire squadron would be dead before Christmas. Colonel Matthews, the fighter group commander, had called an emergency meeting on August 5th. "Gentlemen," Matthews said, looking around the table at his officers, "we're being massacred. Our loss ratio is 0.7 to 1. For every 0 we shoot down, we lose 1.5 P-38s. This is unacceptable. Does anyone have an explanation?" The intelligence officer blamed new Japanese tactics. The operations officer blamed combat fatigue. The training officer blamed inexperienced pilots not following doctrine. Morrison, the engineering officer, blamed inadequate field maintenance. And Kowalski, sitting in the back of the room because sergeants didn't speak in officer meetings unless asked, stayed quiet, but he knew the truth. The truth was that Lockheed's specifications were wrong. The factory tolerances that allowed 5 millimeters of cable slack were based on flight tests in controlled conditions, not real combat. Not desperate life or death maneuvers against Japanese pilots who'd trained for years to exploit every weakness in American aircraft. But how could Kowalski, a sergeant with a high school education, convince a room full of West Point officers and Lockheed engineers that they were wrong? He couldn't. The system didn't allow it, so he decided to work around the system. The first death that really hit Kowalski was Lieutenant James Rooker. July 14, 1943. Rooker was 24 years old. From somewhere in Montana, spoke slowly, with that farmer's drawl, always smiling, always had a joke ready. Rooker had nicknamed his aircraft Montana Belle, had painted the name on the fuselage himself, big clumsy letters that looked like they'd been done by a child. Kowalski had worked on Montana Belle on the morning of July 14th, checked the engines, checked the hydraulic systems, checked the machine guns, checked the control cables, everything within specifications. Rooker took off at 7:15 for a bomber escort over Wook. He didn't come back. The mission report said Rooker had been jumped by 4 Zeros during the return, had tried to roll and dive. The Zeros had anticipated the maneuver, got inside his turn, poured cannon fire into the cockpit. Rooker was seen falling from the sky with the cockpit on fire. No parachute. Kowalski had helped pack Rooker's personal belongings, a photo of a girl, 3 unmailed letters, a pocket watch, a Bible. Montana Belle was written off as a total loss. The second death was Lieutenant Peter Chen, July 21st. Chen was different from Rooker, quiet, serious before the war. He'd been an engineer in San Francisco, always reading technical manuals, doing calculations, trying to understand how everything worked. Chen had come to Kowalski 3 days before he died. Billy Chen said, "Do you feel something strange in the aircraft controls?" "Strange how?" "Like there's a delay. Like you command one thing and the aircraft takes a moment to process before obeying." Kowalski nodded. "I feel it. It's the slack in the cables. But Morrison says it's within specifications." Chen frowned. "Specifications for what? For flight tests in clear sky or for real combat?" "Good question." Chen looked at his aircraft. "I think this slack is going to kill me, Billy. I feel it. Every time I roll, there's this instant where I'm waiting for the aircraft to follow me. And in that instant I'm vulnerable. Talk to Morrison. Make him listen." "I did," he said. "It's psychological combat stress." Chen died 3 days later. Jumped by 2 Zeros over Vitiaz Strait. Tried to roll and escape. The aircraft didn't respond fast enough. 6 20mm rounds went through the cockpit. Chen probably died instantly, at least. That's what they told Kowalski, to make him feel better. It didn't work. The third death was Lieutenant Michael "Mikey" O'Brien, August 2nd. O'Brien was 19 years old, looked 16, babyface. Big ears that stuck out from his flight helmet. He was always nervous before missions, checked everything 3 times, equipment, controls, maps. Kowalski liked the kid. O'Brien reminded him of his younger brother. On the morning of August 2nd, O'Brien was particularly nervous. "Billy," he said as Kowalski checked his aircraft, "do you think I'm going to die today?" It was a question Kowalski hated, because how do you answer something like that? "You'll be fine, kid. Just follow your flight leader. Keep formation, don't do anything stupid." O'Brien nodded, didn't look convinced. He took off at 8:30, came back at 10:15, but not in his aircraft. O'Brien's body was recovered by a rescue boat 3 hours later. He'd managed to get out of the burning aircraft, but his parachute didn't open completely. High-speed impact with water. The report said O'Brien had been jumped by a Zero, had tried to roll to escape. The Zero had gotten inside his turn. The pattern was clear. Roll, delay, death, roll, delay, death, roll, delay, death. And nobody but Kowalski seemed to see it. William Kowalski wasn't special. He knew it. Everyone knew it. He'd grown up in Pittsburgh. Father worked in a steel mill. Mother washed clothes for wealthy families. Kowalski had barely finished high school. Average grades, no particular talent. Before the war, he'd worked in a repair shop, changed oil, fixed brakes. Nothing sophisticated. When Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because the shop was going bankrupt anyway. The Army made him an aircraft mechanic because it was the closest thing to his civilian skills. He went through basic training, learned about aircraft engines, learned about hydraulic systems, learned about machine guns and bombs and radios. He was competent, not brilliant, just competent. And in the Army, competent was enough to keep you alive and employed, but not enough to earn respect from officers educated at military academies and elite universities. When Kowalski had tried to explain the cable problem to Morrison, Morrison's reaction made clear what he thought. Sergeant Morrison had said, with that condescending smile officers use when they want to be polite but are really saying shut up, "I appreciate your ... concern, but I studied aeronautical engineering at MIT. I worked with Lockheed engineers. I understand these systems at a level that, frankly, is beyond your education. The specifications exist for a reason. And these aircraft are within specifications, but the pilots are saying the pilots are scared. That's natural. They're misinterpreting what they feel. The problem isn't mechanical, it's psychological and tactical, and that was it. Kowalski, the sergeant from Pittsburgh who'd barely finished high school, was being dismissed by Morrison, the MIT officer who'd never flown combat but had all the right credentials. It was frustrating, it was humiliating, but more than anything, it was fatal for the pilots who kept dying while men like Morrison debated specifications in air-conditioned offices. On August 5, 1943, after the meeting where nobody listened, after 3 more deaths, after Morrison dismissed him once again, Kowalski made his decision. He would fix the problem, without permission, without authorization, without engineering approval. He would simply do it. And if it went wrong, if an aircraft crashed because of his modification, he'd face the consequences. Court-martial, prison, possibly execution for criminal negligence during wartime. But if he did nothing, more men would die. And Kowalski was tired of packing the personal belongings of 19-year-old boys. The question was, how to fix it? The answer came from the most unlikely place. Kowalski was drinking lukewarm coffee in the mess when Corporal Tommy Nguyen sat down next to him. Nguyen was an armament mechanic, Vietnamese-American from San Jose. Smart, quiet, always thinking. Billy Nguyen said, lighting a cigarette, "You still obsessed with that cable thing?" "Morrison told me to forget it." "Morrison's a credentialed idiot." Nguyen took a deep drag. "You know what my father did before coming to America?" "No, fixed bicycles in Saigon." "And you know the most common problem he saw? Flat tires, loose brake cables." "The bicycles came from the factory with cables within specifications. But the specifications were for normal use. Not for the streets of Saigon where you had to brake fast to avoid being run over by cars and rickshaws and water buffalo." Kowalski looked at Nguyen. "And what did your father do?" "Improvised. Took a piece of wire, bent it into a specific shape, installed it as a tensioner, eliminated the slack. Took 5 minutes. The bicycles braked like new wire. And Nguyen finished his cigarette. "But I never told you this. And you'll never tell anyone it was my idea. Because if something goes wrong, I have a wife and son waiting for me in San Jose." "Understood, understood." Nguyen got up and left, and Kowalski sat there holding his cold coffee, thinking about wire. Wire, the simplest solution in the world, and completely unauthorized. On the night of August 10th, Kowalski walked 6 kilometers through the jungle to an abandoned farm he'd seen during a reconnaissance patrol weeks earlier. The moon was in its first quarter. Enough light to see the path, but not enough to be easily seen if Japanese patrols were in the area. The air was thick with humidity. Mosquitoes buzzed in clouds around his head. He could hear jungle sounds, nocturnal animals, insects, the occasional distant cry of a bird. The farm had been abandoned for months. The house was in ruins. The roof had collapsed. The walls were covered with mold and vines, but the chicken coop fence was still standing. The fence was made of galvanized wire, thick, strong, exactly what Kowalski needed. He used wire cutters to cut several pieces, 15 centimeters each. He took 10 pieces, enough to modify several aircraft if the first attempt worked. He put the wire in his pocket and started the walk back. On the way he thought about what he was about to do. Modifying flight control systems without authorization was one of the most serious violations of military regulation. Control systems were considered critical for flight safety. Any modification required engineering approval, extensive testing, complete documentation. What Kowalski was planning to do was skip all those steps. He would install a non-standard, untested part made from stolen chicken wire in a critical system of a combat aircraft. If something went wrong during flight, the pilot would die and it would be Kowalski's fault. But if he did nothing, pilots would keep dying anyway. So what was the lesser evil? Risk one life to potentially save dozens? Or stay quiet and watch dozens die for certain? Kowalski wasn't a philosopher. He didn't have answers to complex ethical questions, but he had hands and tools and wire, and an absolute certainty that he was tired of watching boys die. Back at the field, Kowalski went to his bunk, put the wire under his pillow, lay down and tried to sleep. He couldn't. He lay staring at the ceiling, hearing the snores of other mechanics, feeling the weight of what he was about to do. At 2:30, he gave up trying to sleep, got dressed, grabbed his tools, grabbed the wire, and walked to the flight line. The maintenance area was empty. Just the distant sound of generators and the omnipresent buzz of tropical insects. The aircraft stood in a row, dark silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. Kowalski chose Lieutenant Carl Fisher's aircraft for the first modification. Fisher was experienced. 14 missions, 6 kills. He'd know if something was different. And if something was wrong, he'd have the experience to handle it and land safely. Kowalski opened his toolkit. The tools gleamed slightly under the dim light of his flashlight: wrenches, pliers, screwdrivers, simple instruments he'd used thousands of times. But tonight was different. Tonight, these simple tools would commit a crime or save lives, or both. Kowalski took a deep breath, picked up the first piece of wire, started bending it into the shape Nguyen had described. Zeesh. 2 contact points on the cable. Even tension distribution. It took 20 minutes to get the shape right. His hands were shaking. He had to stop twice to wipe them on his shirt. Finally, he had the tensioner ready. Now came the hard part, installing it without getting caught. Kowalski finished installing the first tensioner at 3:47 on the morning of August 11th. He'd tested the cable tension by hand. No slack. 0. The control surface responded instantly. It felt perfect. But felt perfect on the ground meant nothing until tested in the air. Kowalski closed the access panel, cleaned all evidence, stored his tools, went back to his bunk, didn't sleep. At 6:15, Lieutenant Fisher took off for a routine patrol over Vitiaz Strait. Kowalski stood on the flight line, watching the aircraft take off, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. And then he waited. Every minute was agony. What if the tensioner failed during flight? What if the wire snapped under G-forces? What if it created a cascade failure that jammed the controls? Kowalski imagined Fisher falling from the sky, screaming on the radio, unable to control his aircraft. Imagined the accident report. Imagined the firing squad. At 8:43, Fisher's aircraft appeared on the horizon, flying normally, approached the field. Normal traffic pattern. Normal final approach. Normal landing. Fisher taxied to the parking area. Shut down the engines. Kowalski walked to him, trying to keep his expression neutral, but his stomach was in knots. Fisher climbed down from the cockpit, took off his helmet, looked at Kowalski with a strange expression. "Billy, did someone work on my aircraft?" Kowalski's heart stopped. Why? Why do you ask, sir? Fisher looked back at the P-38. Because it's flying different. Different bad, sir. Different like someone removed an invisible brake from the controls. Fisher turned to Kowalski. The ailerons respond instantly now. There's no more that little pause. It's like the aircraft is reading my mind. Kowalski tried to keep his voice steady. "Is that good, sir?" Fisher laughed. A genuine, free laugh. "Good, Billy. I was able to do maneuvers this morning I've never been able to do before. I got into a turn with a simulated 0 during training and I got inside his turn. For the first time since I arrived in this theater, I felt like I had an aircraft that could actually fight on equal terms." Fisher looked directly at Kowalski. "What did you do?" Kowalski hesitated, then said, "Just adjusted some cable tensions, sir. Nothing major. Within specifications. Technically, no, sir." Fisher nodded slowly. Then he smiled. "Well, whatever you did, do it to the other aircraft in the flight. And Billy." "Yes, sir." "Don't tell Lieutenant Morrison. He'll want forms and approvals and all that bureaucracy. And while he's filling out paperwork, more of us are going to die." Fisher patted Kowalski's shoulder and walked away. And Kowalski stood there trembling, realizing it had worked. It had worked. The wire tensioner had worked. The word spread faster than Kowalski expected. Fisher flew again the next day, August 12th, this time on a real combat mission, intercept over Woodwhack. He got into a 7-minute dogfight with 3 Zeros. Managed to shoot down 2. The third fled when Fisher came back. He was radiant. "Billy, where's Billy Kowalski?" Kowalski appeared from the maintenance area, wiping grease from his hands. Fisher walked straight to him, grabbed his hand, shook it hard. "You saved my life today. You know that, sir. You fixed the damned aircraft finally, for the first time. I could outmaneuver a 0. I got inside his turn, Billy, inside. That shouldn't be possible in a P-38. Other pilots started gathering. Lieutenant Marcus DeLuca, who'd almost died 3 weeks earlier, asked, "What's Fisher talking about?" Fisher explained. "The modification. The improved response. The dramatic difference in combat." DeLuca looked at Kowalski. "Can you do that to my aircraft?" Well, it's not exactly approved. I didn't ask if it was approved. I asked if you can do it." "Yes, sir." "Then do it. Tonight." Lieutenant James Hawkins, one of the squadron veterans, said, "Do mine too." Another pilot, "Mine too." Another, "Mine." In 5 minutes, 12 pilots had requested the modification. And Kowalski, who'd expected to do this secretly, one aircraft at a time, realized he'd underestimated how desperate the pilots were for any advantage that could keep them alive. But there was also a problem. Captain Robert Sterling, the squadron operations officer, was watching the whole scene. Sterling was a by-the-book officer. Everything documented, everything approved through proper channels. Sterling walked up to Kowalski. "Sergeant, are you making unauthorized modifications to aircraft?" The crowd of pilots went silent. Kowalski straightened his back. "Yes, sir." "Are you aware this is a violation of regulations?" "Yes, sir." Sterling looked around at the pilots, then back at Kowalski. "And you're willing to accept responsibility if something goes wrong?" "Yes, sir." Sterling was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Do my aircraft too." The tension broke. The pilots laughed. Sterling didn't smile. "But Sergeant, if any of these aircraft crash because of your modification, I will personally ensure you face court-martial." "Understood." "Understood, sir." "Good. Now get back to work." Kowalski spent the next 4 nights installing wire tensioners, 1 aircraft at a time, double-checking each installation, testing each cable. And the aircraft started flying differently. The pilots noticed immediately. More responsive controls, faster rolls, ability to get into tighter turns. And most importantly, they started surviving. By August 20th, every aircraft in the 432nd Squadron had the wire tensioner modification, and something remarkable happened. The loss rates dropped. In July, the squadron had lost 9 aircraft. In August, they lost 3. The kill rates went up. In July, the ratio was 0.7 to 1. More losses than victories. In August, it went up to 1.4 to 1. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Other squadrons noticed. The 49th Fighter Group, stationed at Port Moresby, heard rumors. There's something different about the 432nd's P-38s. They're flying better. A mechanic from the 49th, Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, flew to Nadzeb to investigate. Found Kowalski. I heard you figured something out. Some trick. Kowalski hesitated. I don't know what you're talking about. Rodriguez smiled. Look, I have pilots dying too. If you have a solution, I need it. I won't report it. I'll just use it, Kowalski thought. Then said, meet me in the maintenance area tonight. That night, Kowalski showed Rodriguez how to make the wire tensioner, how to bend it, how to install it, how to test it. Rodriguez took notes, asked questions, tested it himself. This is brilliantly simple, Rodriguez said. Why didn't Lockheed do this from the beginning? Because the specifications say it's not necessary. The specifications don't fly combat. Exactly. Rodriguez went back to Port Moresby, started installing tensioners on the 49th THS aircraft, and the word kept spreading. Mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron, always secret, always unofficial. Nobody wanted to be the first to ask for official approval, because official approval meant committees and testing and months of delays, while men kept dying. So the mechanics just did it. And the pilots just flew, and the P-38s just started winning. By September, there were at least 150 P-38s in the Pacific Theater with a wire tensioner modification, and the kill ratios of the entire 5th Air Force started changing. September, 1.6 to 1. Early October, 1.9 to 1. Something had changed dramatically, and High Command wanted to know what. On October 10, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Barnes arrived at Nadzeb for a routine inspection. Barnes was the wing maintenance inspector. Meticulous, rigorous, lived by the technical manual. And he'd noticed something strange in the maintenance reports. Mechanical failure rates had dropped dramatically, but there was no official explanation. Barnes started his inspection at 6 o'clock on October 11th. First aircraft, Lieutenant Fisher's P-38. Barnes opened the boom access panel, shined his flashlight inside, saw the wire tensioner. Sergeant Kowalski. Barnes called, his voice cold. Can you come here? Kowalski walked to him, feeling his stomach sink. Barnes pointed to the tensioner. What is this, a cable tensioner, sir? Is it in the technical manual? No, sir. Was it approved by engineering? No, sir. Was it installed by you? Yes, sir. Barnes walked to the next aircraft, opened the panel. Another tensioner. Next aircraft, another tensioner. Barnes checked 12 aircraft, 12 tensioners each time. His face got redder. After checking the 12th, Barnes turned to Kowalski. How many aircraft have you modified? In this squadron? 24, sir, 24. Barnes looked like he was about to have a stroke. You modified 24 aircraft without authorization? Yes, sir. Are you aware this is sabotage? Are you aware you could be shot? Yes, sir. Then why did you do this? Kowalski looked directly into Barnes' eyes. Because pilots were dying, sir, and the factory specifications were wrong, and nobody was listening. So I fixed the problem. You don't have authority to, with all due respect, sir. Authority doesn't mean anything to a pilot falling in flames. I had a solution. I used it. Barnes was shaking with anger. Come with me now. Kowalski followed Barnes to Colonel Matthews' office. Matthews was in his office with Lieutenant Morrison. Barnes exploded, explained what he'd found. The unauthorized modifications, the regulation violations, the mass sabotage. Morrison went pale. I told him to stop this. I told him the aircraft were within specifications. Matthews raised his hand. Silence. The room went quiet. Matthews looked at Kowalski. Sergeant, you modified flight control systems without authorization. Yes, sir. Are you aware of the penalties? Yes, sir. Why did you do it? Kowalski took a deep breath. Sir, in July, we lost 9 aircraft, 9 pilots. The attrition rate was unsustainable. I identified the problem. Cable slack, creating response lag. I reported it to Lieutenant Morrison. He said it was within specifications, but pilots kept dying, so I decided to fix it. Morrison interrupted. Specifications exist for a reason. You can't just silence. Lieutenant Matthews said, his voice sharp. Matthews looked at Barnes. Colonel, what's your technical assessment? Barnes looked uncomfortable. The modification is technically functional. The tensioner adds preload to the cable, eliminating slack. The design is rudimentary but effective and safe. Barnes hesitated. There have been no reported failures in 3 months of use. Stress loads are within acceptable limits. It's surprisingly well designed for something made from chicken wire. Chicken wire. Morrison went even paler. Matthews ignored Morrison, looked at Kowalski. What was the impact on combat numbers, sir? Since the modifications began, squadron losses dropped 67%, kills increased 58%. Win ratio went from 0.7 to 1.9. Matthews was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Colonel Barnes, can you replicate this modification?" Barnes looked surprised. "Sir, simple question. Can you do this on other aircraft?" "Yes, sir. It's simple. Any competent mechanic could do it, then do it. Every P-38 aircraft in this wing, immediate priority." Morrison stood up. "Sir, this is against all regulations. We need Lockheed approval, proper testing." "Lieutenant, we have proper testing. 3 months of combat operations. 0 failures. Measurable results. That's more testing than most official modifications get. But the regulations are written by people who don't fly combat. I trust Sergeant Kowalski's results more than your Lockheed manuals." Matthews looked at Kowalski. "Sergeant, officially you violated regulations and should face discipline. Unofficially, you saved lives and dramatically improved our combat capability." Matthews turned to Barnes. "Colonel, implement this modification across the wing. Use Sergeant Kowalski as technical consultant, and if anyone from higher up asks where it came from, you'll say it was the result of field maintenance analysis. Don't mention chicken wire." Barnes smiled slightly. "Understood, sir." Matthews looked back at Kowalski, "Dismissed, Sergeant, and ... Good work." Kowalski left the office, shaking, barely believing he'd just escaped a court-martial. But the feeling of relief lasted only until he got back to the flight line. Because there, waiting for him, was a much bigger problem. September 12, 1943, the morning where this story began. Kowalski was under Lieutenant Hayes' aircraft, installing the last tensioner he had in stock, when he heard the voices. "Check the entire line. Every aircraft, I want cable tension reports on each one." It was Barnes, doing his complete inspection. The problem was that Kowalski was in the middle of an installation. The cable was disconnected, the tensioner was partially installed. If Barnes saw this now, in process, it would be impossible to explain. Kowalski had maybe 2 minutes, worked fast, fingers trembling, the cut on his finger bleeding harder with the effort. Inserted the tensioner, forced the clevis pin. It wouldn't go in. It was jammed. The voices were closer. Kowalski hit the pin with the base of his wrench, once, twice. The pin slid into place with a click too loud. "Did you hear that?" Barnes' voice. "Very close now." "I did." Came from Hayes' aircraft. "Shit." Kowalski tested the cable quickly. Tension good. Installation complete. He started to close the access panel. His hands were slippery with blood and sweat. He managed to get 3 of the 8 bolts in before he heard footsteps arriving at the side of the aircraft. There was no time for the other 5. Kowalski left the panel partially closed, grabbed his flashlight and tools, and rolled out from under the wing. He stood up just as Barnes rounded the wingtip. "Sergeant Kowalski, working early this morning?" "Yes, sir. Routine check." Barnes looked at the access panel, then at Kowalski's hands, covered in grease and blood. "You're hurt. Just a small cut, sir. Nothing serious." Barnes nodded slowly. Then he said, "Show me what you were doing." Kowalski's heart stopped. "Sir." "The aircraft." "Show me. I want to see your work." There was no way to refuse. Kowalski led Barnes back under the wing, pointed to the partially closed panel. "Was checking cable tension, sir." Barnes took his own flashlight, shone it through the opening. Saw the tensioner for a long moment. Barnes was silent. Then he turned off the flashlight. "Continue your work, Sergeant, and finish closing that panel properly. 5. Loose bolts is sloppy." "Yes, sir." Barnes started to walk away, then stopped. Kowalski. "Yes, sir." "How many aircraft still don't have the modification?" "This is the last one, sir." Barnes nodded. "Good, because we need to be ready." "Ready for what, sir?" Barnes looked at the eastern horizon. "Intelligence reports the Japanese are planning a major offensive over Rabaul. They're going to throw everything they have at us. 200, maybe 300 aircraft, when next week, maybe sooner." Barnes turned to face Kowalski. "Your modification is going to be truly tested. And if it fails under maximum combat stress, a lot of men are going to die. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "And you're confident?" Kowalski thought about all the installations he'd done, all the checks, all the tests. "Yes, sir, I'm confident." "Good, because I just bet the lives of 200 pilots on your ingenuity with chicken wire." Barnes left, and Kowalski stood there, realizing the weight of what Barnes had said. 200 pilots. Their lives depending on pieces of wire Kowalski had stolen from a chicken coop. The Japanese offensive came on October 15, 1943. 210 Japanese aircraft attacked Allied installations at Rabaul. Zeros, Betty bombers, Val dive bombers. The 5th Air Force responded with 120 aircraft, including 68 P-38s, all with the wire tensioner modification. The air battle lasted for hours. It was the largest air combat in the Pacific Theater up to that point in the war. Kowalski stood on the flight line, listening to radio reports coming in, hearing pilots screaming, hearing victory calls, hearing distress calls. When it was over, the numbers were clear. The Japanese lost 68 aircraft, the Allies lost 14. Win ratio 4.8 to 1. the highest win ratio the 5th Air Force had ever achieved, and of the 68 P-38s that flew that battle, only 3 were lost. Survival rate, 95.6%. The pilots started landing, one by one, damaged aircraft, bullet holes, but flying. Fisher landed with half his left tail torn off, but alive. DeLuca landed with one engine dead, but alive. Hawkins landed with the canopy cracked by shrapnel, but alive. Hayes landed with fuel enough for maybe 2 more minutes of flight, but alive. One by one, they landed. And one by one, as they climbed out of their cockpits, they looked for Kowalski. Fisher was first. He walked straight to Kowalski, didn't say anything, just hugged him. Then DeLuca, then Hawkins, then Hayes. One by one, the pilots who'd survived because their aircraft responded half a second faster, and Kowalski stood there, trying not to cry, realizing it had worked. His chicken wire jury rig had actually worked. That night, Colonel Matthews called Kowalski to his office. Sergeant Matthews said, "You heard the numbers from today's battle." "Yes, sir. 4.8 to 1.95% survival rate." "You know why?" "Many factors, sir. Tactics, training, chicken wire." "Sergeant, chicken wire you installed in violation of 7 different regulations." Matthews stood up, walked to the window, looked at the flight line where mechanics were already working on damaged aircraft, preparing them for the next mission. "I should arrest you," Matthews said. "Should make you an example. Show that nobody can just ignore regulations, no matter how well-intentioned." Kowalski stayed silent. "But if I did that," Matthews continued, "I'd be sending the wrong message. I'd be saying that rules are more important than lives, that bureaucracy is worth more than results." Matthews turned, "And that would be the wrong message. So here's what's going to happen. Officially, there were no unauthorized modifications. Officially, the aircraft improvements are the result of enhanced field maintenance. Officially, you just did your job. And unofficially, sir," Matthews smiled slightly, "unofficially, you saved maybe 200 lives, and changed how this war will be fought. And for that, I owe you a debt I can never repay." Matthews extended his hand. Kowalski shook it. "Now get back to work. Sergeant, those aircraft won't fix themselves." "Yes, sir." Kowalski left the office. Outside, the tropical night was warm and humid. Insects buzzed. In the distance he could hear generators running. He walked back to the maintenance area. His hands were still shaking. Not from fear, not anymore. From something different. Relief, maybe. Or exhaustion. Or the realization that he'd actually done something that mattered. He looked at his hands, covered in grease, cut, calloused, mechanic's hands. Hands that had held wrenches and pliers and pieces of chicken wire. Hands that had saved lives. In November 1943, Lockheed sent a team of engineers to investigate the dramatic improvements in Pacific P-38s. They found the wire tensioners. They were, initially, horrified. Unauthorized modifications, non-standard parts, protocol violations. But then they tested, and the tests showed the modification was safe, effective, and should, admitted the chief engineer reluctantly, have been part of the original design. In December, Lockheed released the P-38J with an improved cable tensioning system integrated from the factory. The Lockheed Technical Bulletin credited the improvement to ongoing engineering analysis and operational feedback. It didn't mention Kowalski. It didn't mention chicken wire. It didn't mention that the modification had been developed by a sergeant with a high school education who'd violated multiple regulations to save lives. The patent for the improved tensioning system was issued to a Lockheed engineer in Burbank who'd never seen combat. Kowalski never received official credit, was never promoted for it, never received a medal in his military record. There's no mention of the tensioner modification. Just the standard notes of a competent mechanic doing his duty. What the pilots remembered: Fisher, DeLuca, Hawkins, Hayes, Sterling. All the men who flew those modified aircraft. All the men who survived because their aircraft responded half a second faster. They remembered, years later, when they wrote memoirs, when they gave interviews, when they spoke at veteran reunions, they told the story of the mechanic who saved their lives with chicken wire. William Billy Kowalski stayed in the Air Force until 1963, 20 years of service. Retired as a master sergeant. Went back to Pittsburgh. Worked in a steel mill, the same one where his father had worked. Married, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. Never talked much about the war. When his children asked, he said he was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes, nothing special. But once a year, always on October 15th, the phone rang. It was Fisher, or DeLuca, or Hawkins, or Hayes. Always the same conversation. "Billy, it's Carl, just calling to say thank you for what?" "Carl." "For keeping me alive another year." And every year Kowalski said the same thing. "Just did my job." But they both knew it was more than that. In 1997, an aviation historian tracked down Kowalski. Wanted to write about field modifications during World War II. Kowalski was 79 years old then, hands still strong, but shaking with arthritis. He confirmed the story of the wire tensioner, then told the historian, "You know what's funny? What? Lockheed made millions selling improved P-38s with the integrated tensioning system. They called it engineering innovation. But it all started with a 15-centimeter piece of wire I stole from a chicken coop. Do Do you feel cheated? Kowalski thought for a long moment. No, I didn't do it for credit. Did it because boys were dying and I could do something about it. Credit doesn't matter. Lives matter. How many lives do you think you saved? Don't know. Never counted. Because if you count the ones you saved, you have to count the ones you didn't save too. And I still think about Rooker and Chen and O'Brien, the ones who died before I did something. Do you carry guilt for them every day? Should have done it sooner. Should have ignored Morrison from the beginning, but you did eventually. Doesn't that count? Kowalski looked at his old hands, hands that had held tools, hands that had bent wire, hands that had saved lives. It counts, he said finally. I guess it counts. William Billy Kowalski died in 2003 at age 85, heart failure, peaceful in his sleep. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his service in World War II. Aircraft mechanic, honored veteran. It didn't mention the wire tensioners. It didn't mention the 200 lives. It didn't mention that he'd changed how a war was fought. His funeral was small. Family, a few old friends, and 4 elderly men who traveled from different parts of the country to be there. Fisher. They look on Harkins and Ailes. All over 80 years old now. All survivors. They stood by the casket. Each placed something inside before they closed it. Fisher placed his pilot wings. DeLuca placed a photo of his aircraft. Hawkins placed his war medals. Hayes placed a piece of galvanized wire bent in a Z shape so you'll have it in your hands when you meet all the others you saved, Hayes said quietly. Kowalski's belongings were divided among family, but one box in the basement was forgotten. Years later, when the house was sold, the new owners found it. Inside were 10 pieces of galvanized wire, each bent in a Z shape, each with a small tag. The tags said, "From a chicken coop 1943, unauthorized, unofficial, unrecognized," but it worked, and 200 men came home because of it. One of those pieces of wire is now in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. It's in a small display case in the corner of the World War II pavilion. The placard says, "Improvised Control Cable Tensioner P-38 Lightning, Pacific 1943, inventor unknown." 99% of visitors walk past without noticing, but it's there. A piece of chicken wire that changed a war. Installed by a man who decided that saving lives was more important than following rules. And somewhere over the South Pacific in some sky that no longer exists, 200 pilots still fly. They fly because a mechanic from Pittsburgh refused to accept that within specifications was good enough when men were dying. They fly because someone cared enough to break the rules. They fly because human ingenuity sometimes comes not from engineering laboratories in Burbank, but from a sergeant lying on his back under a wing in the tropical darkness, with blood on his hands and wire in his tools and the absolute certainty that he couldn't watch boys die anymore. That's the story nobody told you until now. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Every like tells the algorithm that real stories of quiet heroism matter more than empty clickbait. Subscribe because we're unearthing a forgotten story every week. Real heroes who never got credit. Moments that changed wars without appearing in the books. Leave a comment saying where you're watching from. Our community goes from Texas to Perth, from veterans to students, from mechanics to pilots. You're not just a view count. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching. And thank you for ensuring William Kowalski doesn't disappear into silence. Men like him deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.